Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is, we will pretend, Friday. It is Friday for you. It's not Friday for me, but the point is, I don't know, something. Anyway, it's Friday now when you're listening to this, October 21st, 2022. Therefore, time for another show. And as I promised you, that means I'll have to pre-record the thing because I am on the road doing the long weekend recharge your batteries type relaxation thing. I've never liked to use that phrase, but electric renewables are very in these days. So maybe it's very trendy and cool to say that. Anyway, today would be a great opportunity, I thought, for some of the long reads that we like to do occasionally on the show, especially on Fridays. And as Scott, too, is on the road and unavailable to do the summary, I thought I would try and use as few stories as possible, but still fill the maximum amount of time available to us. Not really my plan, but that's how it's going to work out. And yesterday's show, Thursday's show, we just started reading and got about, a third of the way into the very interesting story in the Washington Post under the title of Whites Now More Likely to Die from COVID Than Blacks, Why the Pandemic Shifted. And we got, partway into the very interesting and exciting story. I thought I would conclude that story today because it is a very long read. But what if you didn't hear the first part of yesterday's show? And so I thought I would recap this thing. And probably by recap, I mean reread this thing. I thought about actually just grabbing yesterday's recording and repeating it to save time. But then somehow I thought that would be a lot less interesting somehow. You can, if you wish, fast forward just a little bit and skip the intro if you feel like you remember what went on yesterday. But if not, or even if you do and you just want to hear it again as a setup, this is Akilah Johnson and Dan Keating writing this piece for the Washington Post. A very interesting story about how, over time, guess what? You couldn't actually predict the outcome of the pandemic, and if you thought it was going to go along demographic lines, it turns out that, well, I guess at the very least, if you thought it was going to go along demographic lines that you didn't care about, like, i.e. cities, northeastern cities, blue cities in particular, and the black American population, well, you might have been able to succeed in that, actually, probably, if you hadn't also said, well, I don't want to wear a mask because it's going to smear my makeup, and therefore nobody else who's loyal to me should wear masks, et cetera, and also if you allow even your followers to go along with the idea that somehow the COVID vaccine was no good for them, or that there were other treatments that were just as good, you had every opportunity to tell them, no, listen to me. I'm telling you, I know about these things. I'm very smart. I'm almost a genius. I had an uncle. He taught many, many years at MIT. You got to listen to me. He could have tried that, but they booed him, so he quit. And, well, the outcome could have been different, but instead, now you let the pandemic rage through every place. And the pandemic, the disease, the virus doesn't care where it goes to. So it goes where there's opportunities. People who are unvaccinated, people who hate wearing masks, people who believe it's never going to get them, and so they're never careful about things. And guess what happens? Now the answer is here. Whites now more likely to die from COVID than blacks. Why the pandemic shifted. Let me catch you up to where we left off yesterday so that the rest of the story follows naturally. Again, the byline on the piece here, Somerville, Tennessee. And we start with the story of Skill Wilson. Remember, or maybe you didn't hear yesterday, Skill Wilson had amassed more than 3 decades of knowledge as a paramedic, first in Memphis and then in Fayette County, 2 places that felt like night and day. With only 5 ambulances in the county and the nearest hospital as much as 45 minutes away, Skill relished the clinical know-how necessary to work in a rural setting, doing things like sedating patients to insert tubes into their airways, very important, in the COVID pandemic response. You remember this? But when it came to COVID-19, despite more than 1 million deaths nationwide, and Skill and his family felt their small town on the central eastern side of Fayette County, with its fields of grazing cattle and rows of cotton and fewer than 200 COVID deaths since the start of the pandemic, was a cocoon against the raging health emergency. It was a lot easier to stay away from others, his widow, Holly Wilson, said of the largely white and predominantly conservative county of about 42,000 residents. Less people, less chance of exposure. COVID seemed like other people's problems until it wasn't. The imbalance in death rates among the nation's racial and ethnic groups has been a defining part of the pandemic since the start. To see the pattern, the Washington Post analyzed every death during more than 2 years of the pandemic. Early in the crisis, the differing COVID threat was evident in places such as Memphis and Fayette County. Deaths were concentrated in dense urban areas, where black people died at several times the rate of white people. I don't want to say that we weren't worried about it, but we weren't, said Holly, who described her 59-year-old husband as someone who never took a pill. After a while, you kind of slack off on some things, she said. How he's a paramedic and is just like, screw health sciences, I don't know, but he is. Over time, the gap in deaths widened and narrowed, but never disappeared until mid-October 2021, when the nation's pattern of COVID mortality changed, with the death rate among white Americans sometimes eclipsing other groups. A post-analysis of COVID death data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention from April 2020 through this summer found the racial disparity vanished at the end of last year, becoming roughly equal, and at times during that same period, the overall age-adjusted death rate for white people slightly surpassed that of black and Latino people. The nature of the virus makes the elderly and people with underlying health conditions, including hypertension, diabetes, and obesity, all of which beset black people at higher rates and earlier in life than white people, particularly vulnerable to severe illness and death. That wasn't Skill. The virus also attacks unvaccinated adults, who polls show are much more likely to be Republicans, with a ferocity that puts them at much higher risk of infection and death. That was Skill. He joined the choir, and I think we got that backwards yesterday. I think I actually said that wasn't Skill, but it was. He joined the choir of critics opposing vaccination requirements. His rants in front of the television eventually wearing on Holly, who, even if she agreed, grew tired of listening and declared their home COVID talk free. So, she said, Skill commiserated with like-minded people in Facebook groups and on Parler and Rumble, the largest unmoderated social networking platforms popular with conservatives, or rather the largely unmoderated. We're Republicans and 100% believe that it's each individual's choice, their freedom when it comes to getting a coronavirus shot, Holly said in January. We decided to err on the side of not doing it and accept the consequences. And now, here we are in the middle of planning the funeral. That tells the story pretty well, honestly. Captain Julian Graves Wilson Jr., known to everybody as Skill, died of COVID on January 23rd, a month after becoming infected with the coronavirus. He fell ill not long after transporting a COVID patient to the hospital. At the time he died, infection rates in Fayette County had soared to 40.5% among people taking coronavirus tests. The next section, a different calculus. When the coronavirus appeared in the United States, it did what airborne viruses do, latched onto cells in people's respiratory tract, evaded innate immune response, and multiplied. The pathogen, free of politics or ideology, had a diverse reservoir of hosts and found fertile pathways for growth in the inequalities born from centuries of racial animus and class resentments. Unequal exposure, unequal spread, unequal vulnerability, and unequal treatment concentrated harm in communities that needed protection the most, yet had the least. Cumulatively, Black, Latino, and Native American people are 60% more likely to die of COVID. But As the pandemic progressed, the damage done by the virus broadened, and the toxicity of modern-day politics came to the fore. The post-analysis revealed the changing pattern in COVID deaths. At the start of the pandemic, black people were more than 3 times as likely to die of COVID as their white peers, but as 2020 progressed, the death rates narrowed. But not because fewer black people were dying. White people began dying at increasingly unimaginable numbers too, the post-analysis found. In summer of 2021, the nation saw some of the pandemic's lowest death rates as vaccines, shoring up the body's immune response, became widely available. Then came the Delta variant. The virus mutated, able to spread among the vaccinated. As it did, an erosion of trust in government and in medicine, in any institution really, slowed vaccination rates, stymieing the protection afforded by vaccines against severe illness and death. The Delta's peak in September of 2021, after Delta's peak, that is, the racial differences in COVID deaths started eroding. The post-analysis found that black deaths declined, while white deaths never eased, increasing slowly but steadily until the mortality gap flipped. From the end of October through the end of December, white people died at a higher rate than black people did, the Post found. That remained true except for a stretch in winter 2021 and 22 when the Omicron variant rampaged. The black death rate jumped above white people's when the spike in cases and deaths overwhelmed providers in the Northeast, resulting in a bottleneck of testing and treatment. When the surge subsided, the black death rate once again dropped below the white rate. Usually, when we say a health disparity is disappearing, what we mean is that the worse off group is getting better, said Taslim Padamsi, an assistant professor at Ohio State University who researched vaccine use and was a member of the Ohio Department of Health's work group on health equity. We don't usually mean that the group that had a systemic advantage got worse. I guess you usually get to keep your systemic advantage, but not here. But that's exactly what happened as the white death rate surpassed that for black people, even though black Americans routinely confront stress so corrosive it causes them to age quicker, become sicker, and die younger. The shift in COVID death rates has vastly different implications for public health interventions, said Nancy Krieger, professor of social epidemiology at Harvard University's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Officials must figure out how to connect with communities who are ideologically opposed to the vaccine while contending with the cumulative impact of injustice on communities of color. Think about the fact that everyone who is age 57 and older in this country was born when Jim Crow was legal, she said. What that did was intersect with COVID-19, meaning that embodied history is part of this pandemic too. So, what contributed to the recent variation in death rates, and why? The easy explanation is that it reflects the choices of Republicans not to be vaccinated, but the reasons go deeper. The Post interviewed historians and researchers who study the effects of white racial politics and social inequality on health, spoke with relatives and friends of those lost to COVID, and compiled data from federal databases and academic studies. What emerged is a story about how long-standing issues of race and class interacted with the physical and psychological toll of mass illness and death, unprecedented social upheaval, public policies, and public opinion. Resilience gave way to fatigue. Holes left by rural hospital closures deepened. Medical mistrust and misinformation raged. Skeptics touted debunked alternatives over proven treatments and prevention. Mask use became a victim of social stigma. Many Republicans decided they would rather roll the dice with their health than follow public health guidance, even when provided by President Donald Trump, who was booed after saying he had been vaccinated and boosted. Researchers at Ohio State found black and white people were about equally reluctant to get the coronavirus vaccine when it first became available, but black people overcame that hesitancy faster. They came to the realization sooner that vaccines were necessary to protect themselves and their communities, Padamsi said. As public health efforts to contain the virus were curtailed, the pool of those most at risk of becoming casualties widened. The number one cause of death for 45 to 54-year-olds in 2021 was COVID, according to federal researchers. I still remember when I was doing the mayor's press conferences a few months into this, and I made note of the fact that most of these people who had died looked like me, said James E.K. Hildreth, president and CEO of Meharry Medical College, one of the nation's oldest and largest private, historically black academic health sciences centers in Nashville. Hildreth played a central role in the city's pandemic response. I wondered aloud, if it were reversed, would the whole nation not be more galvanized to fight this thing, recalled Hildreth, an immunologist and member of an expert panel that advises the FDA on vaccines, including coronavirus shots. After it became clear that communities of color were being disproportionately affected, racial equity started to become the parlance of the pandemic in words and deeds. As it did, vaccine access and acceptance within communities of color grew, and so did the belief among some white conservatives who form the core of the Republican base that vaccine requirements and mask mandates infringe on personal liberties. Getting to make this decision for themselves has primacy over what the vaccine could do for them, said Lisa R. Pruitt, a law professor at the University of California at Davis, who is an expert in social inequality and the urban-rural divide. They're making a different calculus. It's a calculation informed by the lore around self-sufficiency, she said, a fatalistic acceptance that hardships happen in life and a sense of defiance that has come to define the modern conservative movement's antipathy toward bureaucrats and technocrats. I didn't think that the polarization would transfer over to a pandemic, Pruitt said. It did. A life-saving vaccine and droplet-blocking masks became ideological Rorschach tests. And this is about where we left off yesterday. We read a little bit more, but then the music was under, and so we rejoin our story here. The impulse to frame the eradication of an infectious disease as a matter of personal choice cost the lives of some who, despite taking the coronavirus seriously, were surrounded by enough people that the virus found fertile terrain to sow misery. That's what happened in northern Illinois, where a father watched his 40-year-old son succumb to COVID-19. For Robert Boehm, the increase in white deaths is politics brought to bear on the body of his son, though he's reluctant, quote, to get into the politics of it all, but it all goes back to that. Brian Boehm was a PE teacher at an elementary school in suburban Chicago. On Christmas Eve, the entire family gathered at the elder Boehm's house in an Illinois town where the first Lincoln-Douglas debate was held. Brian Boehm was there with his 10-year-old daughter and 6-year-old son. Robert Boehm said his son had survived COVID the year before, so we got on his butt to get that booster shot when he was here for Christmas, and he did, but he got sick again, the 73-year-old said. Being vaccinated and all that and getting COVID again kind of bummed him out. Just after the new year, Brian Boehm, who was hypertensive, went to a hospital feverish and vomiting. It took 10 hours to be seen and even longer for a bed to become available. As he waited, he sent what would be his last text message to his parents. "Thanks for all you do. I love you." He went into cardiac arrest in the emergency room and was transferred to Rush University Medical Center in Chicago, one of the nation's top academic hospitals. There, his family hoped he would be healed, but his organs began to fail, and he died on January 8th. The thing that gets me is the people who still don't believe it's serious or even real, but when they get sick, they run to the hospital, Robert Boehm said. You're taking away from heart attack patients and stroke patients. The pandemic, he said, should have been taken seriously from the very beginning, and it wasn't. It was denied. It was downplayed. And it all goes back to one person, as far as I'm concerned. Asked who that was, Boehm would only say, I'll give you 3 guesses. The first 2 don't count. I think we could probably guess. Next section here, stress and its burden. While almost 3 years of chaotic public health crises have left Americans of all races uncertain about the future, they have also revealed the enduring nature of racial and class politics and the cost they extract, including for white Americans. Those triggers are layered upon each other, stoking stress, said Derek M. Griffith, who co-leads the Racial Justice Institute and directs the Center for Men's Health Equity at Georgetown University. It's interesting that it's even a necessity. The men's health equity, okay, pretty interesting. At any rate, whether it's I can't pay my rent and mortgage as easily as I used to, or I want to show I'm not worried about COVID, your body doesn't care where the stress is coming from. It's just experiencing stress, he said. Then add to that how people are coping with the stress. When it comes to racism, most people think of something that occurs between individuals, but it's as much about who has access to power, wealth, and rights as it is about insults, suspicion, and disrespect. Prejudice and discrimination, even if unconscious, can be deadly, and not just for the intended targets. And by the way, can I just talk about how loaded a term that is, intended targets? A growing body of research outlined in the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson shows that even the most anodyne of social exchanges with people of different races, such as glancing at faded yearbook photos, can raise white people's blood pressure and cortisol levels. Yikes, I wonder why that's the case. I mean, that's among avowed racists, I guess I can understand it. It's just, okay, that's very odd. How distressing an idea that is. Stress is a hardwired physiological response triggered at the first sign of danger. But, all right, I mean, I there are people for whom, just imagine that, seeing a picture of a black person triggering as a sign of danger to you. Wow. The brain sounds an alarm, setting off a torrent of neurological and hormonal signals. Although I guess what's giving me problems here is, how hardwired is it physiologically? I mean, I think that's a learned response. I mean, the response then becomes physiological if you're taught to think that way at the beginning. I mean, I guess I'm just curious. I mean, maybe could there be an unconscious response that people who would be upset and dismayed to find out that they're having a physiological response to viewing a picture of a black person might actually be having that response anyway. And now that I'm conscious that there is such a thing, I can't imagine taking such a test and then not responding that way. Oh my God, I don't want to show any evidence that I'm having this. I'm sure that it has to be triggered by being taught to feel those, to have the emotions that would trigger a physiological response. But what if it isn't? What if we're all just inherently racist and there's literally nothing that can be done about it? How terrible would that be? And I don't want to be a part of that. And then, of course, you would find that the stress levels are rising for me. They're rising now, and I'm just thinking about it. What a weird thing. But okay, it's been studied. Stress is a hardwired physiological response, right? Triggered at the first sign of danger. The brain sounds an alarm, setting off a torrent of neurological and hormonal signals. Persistent surges of cortisol and other stress hormones can wear down the body, increasing the risk of stroke, diabetes, heart attack, or premature death by damaging blood vessels and arteries. Overexposure to stress can weaken the immune response and can make it harder to develop antibodies after being vaccinated against infectious diseases. Sometimes the harm is not just biological, but also behavioral. Okay. Now I'm beginning to understand things. We're getting into an area that makes more sense, and to me anyway, but wow. Researchers at the University of Georgia found that white people who assumed the pandemic had a disparate effect on communities of color, or were told that it did, and at first it did, had less fear of being infected with the coronavirus, were less likely to express empathy toward vulnerable populations, and were less supportive of safety measures, according to an article in Social Science and Medicine. Perhaps, the report concludes, explaining COVID's unequal burden as part of an enduring legacy of inequality signaled these disparities were not just transitory epidemiological trends, which could potentially shift and disproportionately impact white people in the future. Translation: racial health disparities are part of the status quo. And then some more charts here illustrating state by state what we're looking at, the various adjusted death rates. And because of that, I'll have to skip over now to the next test. Because of that, government efforts to bring a public health threat to heel are seen by some white Americans as infringing on their rights, researchers said. You're making me stay home, wear a mask, etc., when we really know that only black people are catching this disease and dying. And look at me, I'm white. I guess that's what they're saying, which is incredibly stupid. This is reflective of politics that go back to the 19th century anxieties about federal overreach, said Aya Nuruddin, I'm not certain how you would pronounce the last name, a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University who studies the history of medicine. That is something. Us versus them, the next section here. Questions about the government's role in ensuring the public's health and well-being hang heavy with historical inflections in states such as Tennessee, once home to the president who argued that Reconstruction-era legislation to help and protect newly freed enslaved people violated states' rights. And so, in many ways, the roots of the consternation over recent pandemic control measures began sprouting a century and a half earlier. But that hasn't stopped people such as Civil Miller Watkins from wondering why those roots are choking so many now. The former Fayette County School Board member, who possesses an abiding belief in the power of the common good, said she finds the mindset, I know what's good for me, and if it's harmful for you, you're going to have to deal with it, worrisome amid a pandemic. Yes, to say the least. Living in a rural county is not for the faint of heart, especially as a black person, the 56-year-old said. Still, she can't help but wonder, if I'm the same neighbor you give sugar to, and you know I have an 84-year-old in my house and a little bitty baby at home, why wouldn't you wear a mask around me? It's a question that dogged her over Christmas when 2 of her grandchildren were infected with the coronavirus days before they were scheduled to be vaccinated. We put it on Republicans and politics, she said, but I think we should dig deeper. That's what Jonathan M. Metzl, director of Vanderbilt University's Department of Medicine, Health, and Society, did for 6 years while researching his book, Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. Published in 2019, so well before the pandemic. It's a book about the politicization of public health and mistrust of medical institutions. It's a story about how communal values take a backseat to individuality. It's an exploration of disinformation and how the fear of improving the lives of some means worsening the lives of others. I didn't know it at the time, but I was writing a prehistory of the pandemic, Metzl said in an interview. You're seeing a kind of dying of whiteness phenomenon in the COVID data that's very similar to what I saw in my data. Metzl and Griffith, a Vanderbilt professor at the time, conducted focus groups on the Affordable Care Act throughout Middle Tennessee, including white and black men who were 20 to 60 years old. Some were small business owners and security guards, others factory workers and retirees. The divergent medical experiences of black and white patients permeated Metzl's focus groups, particularly when the conversation veered toward the politics of health and government's role in promoting well-being. Black men described precisely the same medical and economic stressors as did white men, and detailed the same struggles to stay healthy, Metzl wrote, but black men consistently differed from white men in how they conceived of government intervention and group identity. Whereas white men jumped unthinkingly to assumptions about them, black men frequently answered questions about health and health systems through the language of us. Tennessee has yet to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, a decision fueling rural hospital closures at a rate that eclipses nearly every other state because there isn't enough money to keep the doors open. Not only would expanding Medicaid have saved hospitals, Metzl wrote, it would have saved thousands of lives, white and black. Betzel said watching the pandemic unfold felt like a flashback to past battles over federal health care reform. Messaging that leaned into quantitative data about masks and vaccines sounded eerily similar to the mistakes made, at least for part of this country, with the Affordable Care Act, he said. The minute public health infrastructure started to talk about the statistical public health benefits of the mask and not how everyone needed to be on the same page to stay safe, Metzel said, I just knew that it was going to open the door for the same kind of anti-ACA stuff, which is the government's telling you what to do. As Metzel conducted research for his book in 2016, a 41-year-old uninsured Tennessean named Trevor, who was jaundiced and in liver failure, told him, I would rather die than sign up for the Affordable Care Act. When asked why, Trevor, who was identified by first name only, said, we don't need any more government in our lives. And in any case, no way I want my tax dollars paying for Mexicans or welfare queens. Well, okay, he solved that problem, I guess. We don't want any more government in our lives. Well, the government is going to be there. That's the law. Sorry, you lost that vote. So the only other solution, of course, would be to have less of your life in our government. And lo and behold, that's, I guess, what actually happened. Wow. Okay, I would rather die than sign up. Okay, see you later. Now, during the pandemic, there are people like 39-year-old Chad Carswell of North Carolina, whose kidneys functioned recently at just 3%. He was denied a new kidney in January after refusing to take a coronavirus vaccine as required for the transplant at the time, saying, I was born free, I'll die free. I mean, you won't know it after you're dead, and you'll die before you're 40, but okay. Much like protests to repeal and replace the ACA, Metzel said rejecting public health measures is about dogma more than a mistrust of the science of vaccines or masks. We've oversimplified this with mortality rates about the vaccine. Well, we've oversimplified this with mortality rates about the vaccine is good and anti-vaxxers are bad, and they're automatically racist, Metzel said. Being anti-vaccine or anti-mask is part of an ideology. When people get more desperate, they get more ideological. Now, it just happens to overlap, just curiously, with a lot of racism. But I guess it's not necessarily the case that being anti-vax, anti-mask equals racist. It just happens to coincide an awful lot for various reasons. Anyway, next section here, a funeral, a cause. Back to Skill Wilson's story. Skill Wilson's funeral in January was a public testimony to the complexity of people. The room was draped in the unmistakable symbols of patriotism, a steely declaration that this was someone who believed in service and sacrifice for country and community. But not really community. Firefighters sat in row upon row, their dress uniforms, crisp white shirts and formal blue blazers marking the solemn occasion. Maskless faces abounded. His urn, embossed with the firefighters' thin red line flag, you see that a lot, a black and white U.S. flag with a single red stripe across it, the fireman's version of the police thin blue line flag, sat between two firemen's helmets. It is a flag that some have come to see as a political statement, while others view it as a way to honor fallen firefighters. Behind them, a burial flag folded into a crisp triangle. I guess in that sense, very much like it used to be the case with the Confederate flag. Oh, it's not heritage, it's heritage, not hate. This isn't a racist symbol, it's just a symbol of the South. Okay, sure. Interesting, though, that you display that flag. And, I mean, some have come to see it as a political statement, others a way to honor fallen firefighters. I don't know. I'm thinking about just the idea of the thin red line versus the thin blue line thing. I know they want to have their public service first responder moment there, too. But, firefighters protect, yes, from fire. It's just, I don't know. It just doesn't seem as like the same sort of idea. Like no one's ever out there saying defund the fire department, I guess. You know what I mean? But I guess still public service, first responder, put your life on the line, etc. I guess in that sense, it makes more sense that way than the idea of, we're fighting against this social movement that thinks we are racially motivated and wants to defund us. I don't think that's really happening with fire departments. Anyway, it's fire departments that are saying we're going to de-protect you for not, doing what we say, or not paying enough taxes, or I don't know what. Anyway, a succession of eulogies told the story of a man who could make you drive past your highway exit in a fit of rage, who harassed the fire chief until every station in the county had a flagpole that displayed the stars and stripes, who loved sneaking up behind his children and yelling boo. Husband, father, friend, sarcastic, goofy, joker. Skill was one of the constants in my life. For people who didn't really know our friendship, they'd think we hated each other, said Debbie Patterson, a division chief with emergency medical services at the Memphis Fire Department. We were constantly going to battle and name-calling. Some of them are dork, idiot, slacker. But our true term of endearment for each other for years has been, I don't know what this is supposed to be. I mean, I'm guessing it's dashed out. But it looks like bitches. Do we dash that out? Okay. Anyway, he would call at 6 a.m. even if she wasn't on shift, to wake me up and tell me I was a slacker for being on vacation, she said, laughing. During those phone calls, they figured out the day's menu for lunch, bragged about their children and personal lives, and solved the fire department's problems as firefighters do, she said. Of course, we rarely saw eye to eye on anything, she said. The best part about Skill was he could laugh at himself for being a dumbass, too. And they were there, I guess burying him because he was one. Wow. It was a scene of mourning and hope, of bravado and brokenness. There was as much laughter as sorrow, wounds healed by scripture and classic 70s rock. It was a paragon of Southern white masculinity. Last to the lectern was Holly's uncle, who looked out at the sea of uniforms, at the men and women in government service, and assured them that the uncomfortable truths he said he was about to share were not directed at anybody in the room. Skill, he said, was a warrior who put his faith in the system that betrayed him and left him laying on this battlefield during a war he was willing to fight. How many more good men and women, fathers, brothers, mothers, and sisters will be sacrificed on the altar of money before we all stand up and say, this is enough, he continued, adding that Skill and I were on the same page. We had the same worldview. Oh, I see. The government killed him for all the money. I don't know what it's supposed to mean. I mean, I guess you make up a conspiracy theory about it. Big Pharma, which, whatever, but, the vaccine was there for free. He never specified the war, though he said it was one we're all fighting, no matter what lines they try to draw between us. Faith, he said, lies with God and each other, not in those who are solely motivated by profit, like pedophile vampires. Oh boy. But it wasn't about what he said, it was about what he left unsaid. The far-right extremist views that go beyond the bounds of traditional conservative politics and ideals of patriotism. Online, he and the family have shared social media posts and, until recently, sold customized insulated plastic cups bearing the insignia of 3%ers, a decentralized militant movement named after the myth that just 3% of the population fought the British in the American Revolution. It's founded on the idea that armed, quote, patriots should protect Americans from the tyranny of big government, including gun laws, pandemic shutdowns, and racial justice protests. Can't have those. Later, outside in the parking lot while smoking a cigarette, Holly's uncle clarified that the battle is against COVID and shared the popular, yet false, conspiracy that potentially life-saving COVID medications are being withheld by the healthcare system. What he wouldn't do was provide his name, saying he didn't want, quote, little black SUVs showing up at my house. The little SUVs. You don't like those. All right. And then finally, in closing, a discussion of methodology here. The Post applied the standard technique used by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to calculate age-adjusted COVID death rates by race using the CDC's provisional COVID death data that includes race, ethnicity, age, and date of death. Under that procedure, the Post calculated rates for age groups by dividing the number of deaths by the population in that age group. The Post then used a standardized age distribution to create an overall rate for each race ethnicity group. Age-adjusted rates are especially necessary for understanding COVID deaths because the majority of people killed by COVID are age 75 or older, even though that group represents less than 9% of the U.S. population. Additionally, more than 90% of COVID deaths are in people age 50 and older. The COVID death age pattern is important in reviewing deaths by race because white people are disproportionately older. More than 40% of white people are age 50 or older, but less than 30% of black people are in those older age groups. Hispanics are even younger, with less than 25% the age of 50 or older. The age-adjusted rates offset that difference in age distribution to compare deaths as if the races or ethnic groups had the same age distribution. Whites, blacks, Asians, American Indians, and Alaska Natives are non-Hispanic. Hispanics are of any race, so the racial groups and the Hispanic groups do not overlap. For maps, the Post calculated age-adjusted COVID death rates for each race in each state over the course of the pandemic using provisional COVID death data by state. Anyway, so that concludes things. That was a rather odd methodological discourse that probably should have been a sidebar rather than the conclusion of the article, given how dramatic the actual conclusion, really what should have been the conclusion was. But all right. Well, it seems like important information to have if you're going to draw this conclusion about the death rates having flipped. You got to know how they came to that conclusion. So, all right. I don't know. I thought that would be valuable to add when we were reading the story on Thursday. I really felt like I wish we had left more time in order to conclude it, but maybe shoehorning it in one of these recorded pieces is our best option to get you more complete information. Okay, so there's that. And I think in combination perhaps with one of the other recorded segments, which one, we're just not sure yet, we can complete at least one show for the time period during which we'll be away from the microphone. Well, traditionally, we like to add a nice long read for Fridays. At least an esoteric and weird read. And this one, not out of our wheelhouse by any means, but a long read, especially helpful when pre-recording shows, as we're doing today, because they eat up gigantic chunks of time. But they are interesting stories and worthy of discussion and debate, I suppose, just because it's alliterative, to add to the end of that. And but the topic, of course, occupies probably far too much of our time, but we just can't help it. It's Murdery Trader Green. There is a New York Times Magazine, I don't know if you would call it profile, but story on what they call, in the title of the piece, The Problem of Marjorie Taylor Greene, what the rise of the far-right congresswoman means for the House, the GOP, G-O-P, and they use the actual periods in the acronym here, GOP, and the nation. This by Robert Draper, again, the New York Times Magazine, which means it's freaking long. There's going to be a lot of investigations, or as she may say, there's going to be a lot of investigations, Marjorie Taylor Greene said, describing what she anticipates if the Republicans regain the House majority this November. I've talked with a lot of members about this. Okay, sure. It was early September, 2 months before the midterm elections, and Greene, the first-term congresswoman from Georgia, was sitting in a restaurant in Alpharetta, an affluent suburb of greater metropolitan Atlanta. Among the fellow Republicans with whom Greene said she had been speaking about these investigations was the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy. Probably true. Not discussing things anymore with Madison Cawthorn because he's a non-entity, a non-factor now. So he's cut out of that loop. Probably still talking to Matt Gaetz, though. Anyway, just a couple of weeks later, on September 23rd, Green sat directly behind McCarthy in a manufacturing facility in Monongahela, Pennsylvania, as he publicly previewed what a House Republican majority's legislative agenda would look like. Among the topics she and her colleagues have discussed is the prospect of impeaching President Joe Biden, a hopeless cause, of course, thankfully, a pursuit Green has advocated literally since the day after Biden took office, and I think actually from before he took office, when she filed articles of impeachment accusing Obama's vice president of having abused his power to benefit his son Hunter Biden's business dealings in Ukraine. My style would be a lot more aggressive, of course, she told me, referring to McCarthy. For him, I think the evidence needs to be there. But I think people underestimate him in thinking he wouldn't do it. I like the way that sentence trails off into something different here. For him, I think the evidence needs to be there. For me, F it. I don't care whether there's evidence or not. But more importantly, I don't think people underestimate whether or not he would do it without evidence. I think I can make him do it without evidence because he's a spineless idiot and a weasel. But, didn't come out quite that way. In Green's view, a Speaker McCarthy would have little choice but to adopt Green's, quote, a lot more aggressive approach toward punishing Biden and his fellow Democrats for what she sees as their policy derelictions and for conducting a witch hunt against former President Trump. I think that I think that to be the best Speaker of the House and to please the base, not necessarily the same things, he's going to give me a lot of power and a lot of leeway, she predicted in a flat, unemotional voice. She just predicts that. I think in order to do the things he needs to do, he's going to give me a lot of power. And of course she would think that. She is very stupid. But she may also be right, because as it turns out, both Kevin McCarthy and the base are also very stupid. So it could all happen. Don't rule it out. I mean, it's a dumb prediction otherwise, but given how dumb Kevin McCarthy is, it's a real possibility. And if he doesn't, the quote continues, they're going to be very unhappy about it. I think that's the best way to read that, and that's not in any way a threat at all. I just think that's reality. But she also thinks Jewish space lasers are a reality. I gotta throw that back in there. Though the 48-year-old self-described Christian nationalist possesses a flair for extreme bombast equal to that of her political role model Trump, maybe, Green's assessment of her current standing within the Republican Party, owing to the devotion accorded her by the party's MAGA base, would seem to be entirely accurate. We'll see. Over the past 2 years, Green has gone from the far-right fringe of the GOP ever closer to its establishment center without changing any of her own beliefs. If anything, she has continued to find more extreme ways to express them. When she entered electoral politics in 2019, she had spent much of her adult life, and I would have put that in quotes, as a co-owner with her husband of her family's construction company. Her husband, Perry Green, recently filed for divorce, it notes parenthetically. She threw herself into her first campaign, and this is interesting too. I assume they're going to get back to this, but I can't wait. I mean, what she had spent much of her adult life doing wasn't really so much. I mean, it happened. She did co-own the family's construction company, but the bulk of her adult life was spent in the gym and owning a gym when she became, such an addict of CrossFit that she couldn't simply satisfy her interests by exercising at someone else's gym. She had to own her own gym. And, that's admirable too, owning a business. There is something to be said for that. She already owned one, so now she owns two. She's extremely ambitious, whatever. I don't care if you're that into your exercise. I guess that's okay. Although, as it turns out, it ends up being a euphemism for, she wanted to be able to hire trainers that allegedly she could have improper extramarital affairs with, I guess they're all improper. I don't know. Maybe if you have an agreement, and who knows what kind of agreement he has, we'll figure out what sort of agreement she may have had with Perry once the divorce proceedings start, I guess, if we're interested in that. But without even passing judgment on all that, which I've already done, but the other part of it is she actually spent as much, if not more time, it seems, in her adult life on her social media presence and her podcasting and video casting and harassing teenagers who had been at the Parkland, Florida high school shooting, et cetera, et cetera. And that was her major pursuit. Conspiracy theory, QAnon craziness, and making screechy videos. That's what she spent the bulk of her adult life on. That's why I put it in quotes. Running a construction company and exercising a lot, so much so that you buy your own gym, is perfectly adult. You know, having sex with the staff, I mean, that's adultery, so I guess it's adult, but, you know, whatever. Anyway, she threw herself into her first campaign that May with almost no strategic planning or political networking and a social media history replete with hallucinatory conspiracy theories. When she switched to a more conservative district, and again, you know, history replete with, doesn't that belong in the description of much of her adult life? I think so. When she switched to a more conservative district in the middle of the 2020 campaign and won, she was roundly dismissed as an unacceptable office holder who could be contained, isolated, and returned to sender in the next election. And yet, in 2021, her first year in Congress, Greene raised $7.4 million in political donations, the fourth highest among the 212 House Republicans, a feat made even more remarkable by the fact that the three who outraised Greene, McCarthy, the minority leader, Steve Scalise, the minority whip, and Dan Crenshaw of Texas, were beneficiaries of corporate PACs that have shunned Greene. As Trump did during his candidacy, Greene maintains that it is in fact she who refuses all corporate donations. That another parenthetical note. In another measure of her influence within the National Party, Greene's endorsement and support have been eagerly sought by 2022 GOP hopefuls like the Arizona gubernatorial nominee Kari Lake and the Ohio U.S. Senate candidate J.D. Vance. Within the House Republican Conference, McCarthy has assiduously courted her support, inviting her to high-level policy meetings, parentheses here, such as a discussion about the National Defense Authorization Act, which sets Department of Defense policy for the year, and, according to someone with knowledge of their exchanges, offering to create a new leadership position for her. Now, mind you, she serves on no committees whatsoever, much less the Armed Services Committee. But interestingly, she's called in about the National Defense Authorization Act. No word on what she might have contributed to that, but probably looking for gotcha amendments to add to the, as a motion to recommit on that or something like that. McCarthy's spokesman denies that the minority leader has made such an offer. When I asked Greene if the report was inaccurate, she smiled and said, "Not necessarily." But then she added, "I don't have to have a leadership position. I think I already have one without having one." Which means you don't have one, but okay, I see what you mean. I think, and that sums her up in a nutshell. I think I already have one. She may be right. She may not be entirely crazy to think she has one, but it's also a little delusional. Greene's metamorphosis over the past year and a half from pariah to a position of undeniable influence presents a case study in GOP politics in the Trump era. That's probably true. The first time I saw Greene in person was on the morning of January 6th, 2021. I wonder what was going on. She was barreling down a crowded corridor of the Longworth House office building, conspicuously unmasked at a time when masks were still mandated by the U.S. Capitol rules. And of course, she had been photographed. Was it before then or following January 6th, where she was, largely loud and vocal about the mask mandates, but was happily wearing one in the airport in order to get her ass out of town. She wants that flight. She wears the mask. Anywhere else she can get away with it. Screw you, the rest of you. Okay. Anyway, So her all-male retinue of staff members striding briskly beside her were also maskless. In the late hours after that day's insurrection, one that the Georgia freshman arguably had egged on with her innumerable claims that the 2020 presidential election had been stolen and her assertion to a Newsmax interviewer that January 6th would be, quote, our 1776 moment. Not so far. Green stood on the House floor and objected to the Michigan election results, a move that was promptly dismissed by the presiding officer, Vice President Mike Pence, because the Congresswoman had no U.S. senator to join her in the motion as the rules prescribed. The day after the insurrection, Green sat in a corner of her office in the Longworth office building, being interviewed for a right-wing YouTube show by Katie Hopkins, a British white nationalist who had been banished from most social media outlets for her Islamophobic and racist comments. The channel that carried her show has since been taken down by YouTube. The Georgia freshman reflected somberly on the events of the previous day. Last night and into the early morning hours was probably one of the saddest days of my life, scariest and loneliest days of my life. Of course, she's on video snickering and laughing in the secure location where they relocated all the members to. She was having a grand old time in there. On the third day of the job as a new member of Congress, just having our Capitol attacked, being blamed on the president that I love, and I know it's not his fault, and then having it blamed on all the people that supported him, 75 million people, 75 plus million people that have supported President Trump and have truly appreciated all his hard work. She goes into speechifying here. But this in America First policies and everything about MAGA. Trump received 74.2 million votes, they explain, in 2020. It was extremely lonely in there watching basically the certification of the Electoral College votes for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, even though we know the election was stolen and the Democrats were working so hard on it, but Republicans too, there were Republicans also. So kind of nonsensical, but you see a couple of things that she's trying to get across there. Anyway, Hopkins listened attentively. Her face nodded with anguish and observed, it's almost as if you're one of them. You're almost like one of those who could have been at the rally. I am one of those people, Green said emphatically. That's exactly who I am. It is. She's right. Hastily, as if realizing the implication of what she had said, she added, I'm not one of those people that attacked the Capitol yesterday. I completely condemn that. I completely condemn attacking law enforcement. I support our police officers, and I thank them for their courage yesterday in keeping us safe. I know there were bad actors involved, and investigations are underway, and it's Antifa. I know there's investigations, but let me tell you what the conclusion of the investigation ought to be. It's Antifa. Listeners, the conclusion was that it was not at all Antifa. Anyway, more parenthetical comments here from our writer. In subsequent months, Green would blame the FBI for possibly instigating the violence on January 6th. She also voted against awarding police officers who defended the Capitol that day the Congressional Gold Medal, its highest honor. Green also said to Hopkins, I'm not a politician, which of course is what she is. Like much of what she said during the interview, this statement was not altogether accurate. Her precocious gift for offending and demonizing qualified her as a natural for the trade, as it had come to be reimagined by Trump and his acolytes. Still, days after her swearing in, Green came off as a somewhat desperate attention seeker with nowhere to go but down. That was the impression early on, yes, no doubt about that. Some in her own party mocked her for her past allegiance to the QAnon conspiracy theory and current allegiance, made public in Facebook posts and videos that have since been deleted, and for her abiding fealty to a disgraced former president. Ronna McDaniel, the chairwoman of the Republican National Committee and a Trump ally, would soon publicly describe some of Green's comments as, quote, atrocious. The Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell, would refer to her views as a cancer on the party. Her victory in the mostly white and rural 14th Congressional District of Georgia was cast as a kind of epical fluke, a wrong turn that would surely be corrected with the next election, not a foretelling of where the Republican Party was headed in the wake of Trump's presidency. A month later, I sat in the House press gallery as Greene was stripped by the Democrat-controlled House of her 2 committee assignments after several of her past outrageous social media posts surfaced. But Greene had learned from Trump the value of never admitting wrongdoing or asking for forgiveness. I attended her news conference the next day, at which she declared, "The party is his. It doesn't belong to anybody else." The committeeless freshman proceeded to spend her ample available time on right-wing media outlets like Newsmax and the former Trump advisor Steve Bannon's War Room podcast. An early sign that she was not an ineffectual outlier came that April, when she reported raising a staggering $3.2 million in her first quarter, a majority of it coming from small donors. I mean, you should keep in mind, it's a remarkable achievement, however you get to it. That's true. But you should keep in mind that her ample free time was spent fundraising. I mean, that's what all Congress people's free time is spent doing, fundraising. It's just that she has considerably more of it. So it stands to reason that she would raise considerably more. Plus, of course, she's talking crazy to crazy people, and that tends to part them from their money rather quickly. In the wake of Trump's departure from the White House, Greene fulfilled a yearning from the MAGA base for a brawler who shared their view that the left had stolen its way to victory and was bent on destroying America. In May of 2021, I attended an America First rally in Mesa, Arizona, featuring 2 of the state's well-known congressmen, the House Freedom Caucus Chairman Andy Biggs and the veteran right-winger Paul Gosar, along with Greene and her fellow MAGA foot soldier, Representative Matt Gaetz of Florida. As she paced the stage, Greene's hold over the Arizona audience that night was confirmation that her constituency extended well beyond Northwest Georgia. "Who do you think won Arizona on November 3rd?" she asked the crowd. When they replied by chanting Trump's name, Greene said, "That's how we feel in Georgia, too. As a matter of fact, that's how Michigan feels. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I think that's how at least 74+ million people feel. As a matter of fact, no one went out for Biden. Did you see rallies like Trump had?" By this time, I had visited her district and had begun getting to know her top aides. In February, they persuaded Greene to meet with me in Rome, Georgia, for an off-the-record lunch. 3 months later, I watched her campaign in her district just before the Georgia primary as she ran for re-election. This is interesting, the way the reporter, it's like visiting Osama bin Laden in the caves of Afghanistan. I'm not supporting what he's doing or saying. I'm just trying to get to the bottom of the person, what's really going on in this district. These caves in Northwest Georgia. Anyway, I watched her campaign in her district just before, the Georgia primary as she ran for re-election. She and I spent more than an hour talking one-on-one on the record that day. Subsequently, we met 3 times in Washington and once in Alpharetta for on-the-record interviews and once more in her Washington office, also on the record, so that I could see her interact with her congressional staff and colleagues. Throughout this 18-month span of reporting, Greene's messaging machine achieved a kind of wall of sound inescapability. Her daily litany of often vicious taunts, factual contortions, and outright falsehoods on social media and behind any available lectern depicted a great nation undone by Biden's Democrats, with allusions to undocumented immigrants as rapists, transgender individuals as predators, Black Lives Matter protesters as terrorists, abortion providers as murderers, and her political opponents as godless, pedophilia-coddling communists, which is nothing like what the QAnon conspiracy theorists say. She's disavowed them, you see. The Trumpian media ecosystem where these phantasms originated saw Greene as their most able exponent, while Trump himself, in a news release earlier this year, proclaimed her, quote, a warrior in Congress, adding, she doesn't back down, she doesn't give up. Oh, this is Trump. She doesn't back down, she doesn't give up, and she has always been with Trump, which apparently he encloses in quotes for some reason. The name Trump, that is. The latter distinction mattered. That's the part that matters to him. He's absolutely right there. By the end of 2021, The House GOP's most powerful female member, the conference chairwoman, Liz Cheney, had been booted out of her leadership position and demonized by the base for condemning Trump. 2 months into 2022, barely over a year into her career as an elected official, Green told me that she and the former president had already discussed the possibility of her being his running mate in 2024. Ooh, that would get rid of her from the House. That would be a genius move. Brilliant. Please, I don't want to risk anything, and I don't want to be like, oh, we should absolutely engineer Trump's nomination so that we can totally beat him because, anything could happen. And I'd hate for her to be elevated in any way. But since we're going to be working to defeat Trump anyway, and fingers crossed it works, we could be rid of her, from a position of political power, at least for a little while. She might run again and win again. You never know. She could, who knows? I don't know what the law is like in Georgia. Maybe she could run for her district and run for vice president. I don't know. But then, again, maybe she'll trip and fall into a wood chipper. And, I'm just, as for wish casting, I go for it, I guess. Anyway, let's see. So she's going to be the running mate, she says. Again, anything can happen, and I hate to say that, well, like, if she turns out to be right, then she's got her finger on the pulse of America or something like that. Maybe she does. I don't know. I hope not. It's certainly the pulse of a very sick individual in America. That she's got the finger on the pulse on. I have no doubt about that. But again, just sort of the delusional thing. I don't know. It seems delusional, but she does seem to be gaining in power. He is right about this. That's the scary part. But again, I've always been baffled by, I guess that's the explanation. She just feels unstoppable because no one has ever stopped her. Before she was sworn in as a member of Congress, she's meeting with the then president of the United States in the White House to plot the coup to overthrow the government of the United States. She hasn't served not a minute in Congress, and she's in the room. 3 days in, she's leading the riot. Then she's booted off of the committees, becomes the biggest fundraiser. Now she might have a leadership position created for her by the guy who dreams of being the next Speaker of the House. And P.S. I might also be the vice presidential running mate of Donald Trump. She's pretty sure all these things are just kind of coming her way. And, if you're a big believer in whatever you want to call it, karma, payback, what goes around comes around, pride going before a fall, you name it, she's really walking into it. But sometimes we see these things don't come to fruition. Just look at Donald Trump. We're waiting, but we've been waiting a long time. What does she say about being the running mate? I would be honored, of course, she says, of this prospect, though she also acknowledged that the GOP advisors would urge Trump to think twice about a candidate as divisive as herself. Or if you're into the British pronunciation, is it British to say divisive? I don't know. Maybe just everything that sounds weird and funky I think of as British. Could be Canadian. Anyway, I think the last person that the RNC or the National Party wants is me as his running mate. I guess that's a self-deprecating statement, meant to distance her from it so that she doesn't sound disappointed when she doesn't get it. Regardless of her future prospects, Green's observation to me in September that she didn't need an official leadership position to enjoy an unofficial one seems beyond dispute. What has received far less discussion than the outrageousness of her daily utterances is what the sum total of them portends for America under a Republican majority with Green in the vanguard. In recent months, she has continued to insist that Trump won the 2020 election. She maintains that America should have a Christian government and that open prayer should return to classrooms. She has called for the impeachment of not just Biden, but also Attorney General Merrick Garland and the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, for the defunding of the FBI after the agency searched Mar-a-Lago to retrieve secret government documents that Trump took from the White House, for expulsion from Congress of those she claimed were communists. And among those she is referred to as communists are the progressive icon Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York and the January 6th committee member Jamie Raskin of Maryland, and for the congressional congressional investigation into the business activities of Biden's son, Hunter. I think that ends the list here for the moment. But keep in mind, by the way, she calls for the expulsion of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. One of the other activities she is on her own videotape doing before she ever enters Congress, before she even enters Congress, before she's even elected to Congress, she videotapes herself as AOC's stalker, stalking her and sticking her face through the mail slot of the closed and locked door of AOC's congressional office, taunting her, daring her to come out. And I mean, basically, like, standing out there taunting and threatening, I assume threatening violence, though she would say, I never did that. I would never be violent, et cetera, et cetera. There's a congresswoman has had to lock her office door to get away from this crazy stalker lady with the video camera and the vague threats. And by the way, not appearing anywhere in the video are Capitol Police responding at all in any way to this threat. But that's the kind of thing she put out there before running for Congress. I just, want to make that clear. I don't know how long your history as a stalker has to go before somebody does something about this. So far, she would point to my prediction of the idea that she is a QAnon assassin in disguise carrying a member's pin as wrong because she hasn't yet murdered anybody as far as we know. But give her another chance. Validate her again with another election. Put her in the majority. See what happens. Really, you shouldn't. I'm just saying the worst may be yet to come. Now, other demands that she's making or visions she has for the future include, or I guess are reflected in the fact that she has introduced legislation to suspend all immigration into the United States for the next 4 years, as well as a bill that would impose up to 10 to 25-year prison sentences on medical specialists who provide hormone treatment or surgery to transgender youth under 18. Green believes that abortion should be banned and that gun control laws should be overturned. She favors eliminating any and all regulations that were intended to address climate change because, in her view, the climate has always changed and no amount of taxes and no government can do anything to stop climate change. In late September, and why she has such a, can't-do attitude, I have no idea. At any rate, why is it that position anyway? I know why. The position is they don't want to do anything about climate change. If you could, she wouldn't want to because something reasons, or she thinks it would cost her money, or I don't know what. But it's just to her advantage, I guess, to do nothing. Where were we? In late September, and hardly for the first time, she excoriated a number of her Republican colleagues, suggesting they were abettors to a globalist conspiracy in tweeting 21 Republican senators just voted with the woke climate agenda by ratifying an international agreement to phase down the use of hydrofluorocarbon pollutants in coolant systems. Oh no, can't have that. More than once, Green has insisted to me that her America First agenda, divisive at its core, nonetheless commands a vast following, including some Democrats who may not care for her coarse rhetoric, but still embrace one or more of her precepts. I'm speaking for so many people, she told me in Alpharetta 2 months before an election that may give voters a preview of an America under an army of murdery traitor Greens. Her political career began in the early months of 2019, when then-citizen Green began showing up on Capitol Hill, in part to boost her social media standing by posting YouTube videos of her harassing Democratic staff members, but also to try to lobby GOP senators against gun safety legislation. Green was outraged to see the 18-year-old Parkland school shooter survivor David Hogue, who in one of her more notorious videos, she taunted while chasing him outside the Capitol, sauntering in and out of, she saw him sauntering in and out, and that's really kind of unfair that the writer will even go along with that description, sauntering in and out of several Senate offices. Visiting them? Yes. Green had considerably less success scoring appointments with Republican senators. I had 0, she lamented to her social media followers. Guess what? I'm a gun owner. I'm an American citizen and I have nothing. But this guy with this George Soros funding and his major liberal funding has got everything. I want you to think about that. Well, of course, one, he had no Soros funding. I don't know how much major liberal funding he had, but he went and he met with, and I don't think he met with Republican senators, maybe one or two, I suppose. Perhaps he met with a bunch of them. I don't really know. But he was sort of an established advocacy figure at that point. Not very long established, but everybody knew what his credentials were. It was having all of his friends murdered and daring to speak out. But he probably had more meetings with Democratic senators because he's more Democratic leaning. She's a Republican. Could she get meetings with Republican senators? Maybe, maybe not. What does the funding have to do with it? Not very much. Just being a serious person and asking for serious things in serious ways will get you those things. But being a QAnon conspiracy nut will probably get you shunned, or at least in 2019 it got you shunned. Now it will get you welcomed into more offices. Try again. See if you can get some meetings. I bet you can. Not to mention the idea, weirdly enough expressed, because she's kind of scatterbrained. I mean, hey, so am I. But all right. But her brains, the brains that got scattered were considerably less organized to begin with, I think. I want to go back to this part. I got 0 meetings, even though I'm a gun owner. Like, what was that going to do for you, you think? I mean, if you call up honestly, if you call a Republican senator's office and say, I've got guns and I want to meet with the senator, how's that? Could we have that happen? No? That's weird. Why did you? Now, of course, you could say, well, I'm a gun owner and I'm concerned with gun owners' rights and I want to talk to them about that. That might even work. Just sort of an interesting thing to say. Why did I get no meetings? I have guns, you know. Well, you know, it's just not really a great advocacy position, if you ask me. Green was certainly thinking about it. That is when she said, I want you to think about the fact that George Soros got him meetings and my guns didn't help me at all. She was thinking about it when she got turned away from the offices of Republican senators like Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and her own Georgia senators, David Perdue and Johnny Isakson. She was thinking about it as she stood in a line in March of 2019 to attend a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing to consider gun control legislation. A lone opponent surrounded by gun safety activists. I've been feeling really outnumbered and really sad standing in this line, she confided to her Facebook Live audience. A month later, Green acknowledged to fellow right-wing YouTuber Alex Madagian, I don't know, maybe that's it, that not all the progressives she encountered were funded by Soros. Many of them, like her, were just showing up, and they took off work to be there too. I think conservatives have got to stop making the excuses. She went on saying, conservatives are going to have to get over themselves. Conservatives were so selfish in so many ways. That's true. We will spend on our very nice handbags, and we will spend on our golf clubs, but I guess not spend on taking off work and, you know, babbling to senators only to have them ignore them. And that's what would happen. Even if you're very sophisticated about it, you end up babbling to senators and they kind of ignore it. And it's kind of annoying, I'm sure. Less than a month after that April interview, Green, who had previously identified herself on Federal Election Commission donor forms as a contributor to the Trump campaign, those forms, the Trump campaign's forms, she identified herself as variously a construction firm owner, a CrossFit gym owner, and a homemaker, depends on, you know, who you're trying to impress with which form, decided to run for elective office to represent Georgia's 6th congressional district, where she actually resided. It was a story she would tell friends, how she, a taxpayer and job creator who cared about the Constitution, had been turned away by Republicans whose salary she paid. That's why she decided to run for Congress. Okay. On May 30th, 2019, Green announced her candidacy on a conservative talk radio show, followed by a Facebook Live post. A Republican activist, local Republican activist, Lawton Sack, happened to catch the announcement on Facebook Live. Wondering who Green was, Sack started searching the internet. He came upon several of her Facebook videos, including one posted 2 years earlier in which Green suggested that the 2017 mass shooting in Las Vegas was staged by leftists as a pretext for seizing America's guns. And we never get around to seizing those guns. It's so annoying. We keep staging things and then forgetting to follow up. Sack posted on his website, georgiapaul.com, that same afternoon, under the headline, Las Vegas shooting conspiracist running in Georgia 6. Sack's post went unnoticed. Despite Greene's preternatural talent for attracting attention, her obscurity in the political world worked to her benefit in the early months when her principal competition in the 6th District's Republican field was its former Congresswoman, Karen Handel. As soon as Greene announced her campaign, she pledged her allegiance as the Trumpiest candidate in the primary. Everyone knows I support, I guess she's tweeting here. I support real Donald Trump, his old Twitter handle. Always have, right from the start. This last part was untrue. Greene did not vote in the 2016 primary, nor did she contribute to Trump's campaign until a few weeks before he was elected president. What was true was that right from the start of her own campaign, Greene was telling local Republicans that she intended to run just as Trump had, all heat and hyperbole, reliant on small online donations and her personal wealth rather than the establishment Republicans who wanted nothing to do with her. Like Trump, she described herself as a successful business owner. His campaign slogan was Make America Great Again. Hers was Save America, Stop Socialism. So grounded. Few believed she had any chance of winning, probably not against Handel, and almost certainly not in the general election against the incumbent Democrat Lucy McBath. Then Greene received a decisive break. That December, Tom Graves, the GOP congressman representing the 14th District in northwest Georgia, announced that he would not run for another term, one in a growing number of establishment Republicans who had made for the exits during the Trump era. An open seat in a district that Trump carried by 53 points in 2016 was suddenly up for grabs. Though Greene had made a virtue of her residency in the 6th District, even telling the local podcast host Ben Burnett just a couple of days before Graves' surprise announcement, I understand our district. I understand it uniquely because it's where I've always lived and it's where I've raised my family and worked for so many years. Even after that, she would now cheerfully run as a carpetbagger. Instantly, her political fortunes changed. Running as a Trumpist firebrand in a suddenly vacant seat, Greene received pledges of support from the most prominent conservative in the GOP, they use they actually type out G period, O period, P period. Makes it very hard for me to do my GOP thing. Anyway, Greene received pledges of support from the most prominent conservative in the House, Jim Jordan of Ohio, and Debbie Meadows, the wife of Trump's eventual chief of staff, Mark Meadows, and founder of Right Women PAC. Greene's campaign staff immediately printed a flyer highlighting Jim Jordan's seal of approval. Her first campaign ad began with, quote, AOC wants to plunge us into communism, referring to Ocasio-Cortez, and ended with President Trump needs more support in Congress. After a black man, George Floyd, was killed by a Minneapolis police officer on Memorial Day and nationwide protests erupted, some leading to violence and significant property damage, Greene posted on June 2nd on her campaign website a video of herself holding a custom AR-15 pistol accompanied by these words, here's my message to Antifa terrorists. Stay the hell out of Northwest Georgia. You won't burn our churches, loot our businesses, or destroy our homes. Well, that's right. They won't because they don't burn any churches or loot any businesses or destroy any homes in Northwest Georgia anyway. Do they burn churches? Haven't run into that one. Loot businesses? I've seen them break some windows. I guess they probably did some looting in there as well. Destroy the homes? Haven't seen that one happen yet either. Already covering two races that could determine control of the Senate, the Georgia media took little notice of the congressional race in the state's northwestern corner, much less the wealthy far-right conspiracist who didn't even live in the district. Greene did not encounter indifference. No one was laughing in her face for describing AOC and Antifa as enemies of America. No one lectured her on the imprudence of wielding a military-style weapon in campaign ads. On the contrary, walking door to door throughout northwest Georgia, Greene could see very early on she would tell me more than a year later that its constituents saw the world through the same lens that she did. Within days, she was certain that a majority of these voters would be hers. On January 9th, 2020, Green came in first in the GOP primary, 19 points ahead of the establishment Republican who had been expected to win, the neurosurgeon John Cowan. Trump tweeted his approval. "A big winner! Congratulations!" In the August runoff, Green thrashed Cowan, whose endorsers included the House Minority Whip, Steve Scalise, by 14 points. At her victory party in Rome that evening, the exultant winner said of Speaker Nancy Pelosi, "We're going to kick that bitch out of Congress." The next day, Green received a congratulatory phone call from the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, who later told a confidant, according to that person, "Clearly, I'm going to have to sit her down and tell her that you can't call the speaker a bitch." Instead, Green tripled down. That day, she received congratulations from McCarthy. She memorialized her "kick that bitch out of Congress" sentiment on Twitter. The day after that, she told a Georgia radio interviewer, "In a fired-up moment, I did call her a dirty name, but I won't back down. I don't apologize." In November of 2020, during the week-long orientation period for newly elected members of Congress, Julie Conway, the director of the prominent conservative Women's Political Action Committee, VIEW PAC, hosted a reception at the GOP-affiliated Capitol Hill Club for the 30 or so House Republican women it had endorsed. A single uninvited guest arrived, one who happened to be the only maskless person in the room, according to multiple attendees with knowledge of what took place. "Julie," one of the women whispered in Conway's ears, "she's coming at you. And she's a QAnon terrorist and assassin, so watch out," I would have said. Murdery traitor Green introduced herself. Then she added, in a voice both hurt and defiant, "I know that you and ViewPack weren't supportive during the campaign." Conway replied, "Well, to be fair, no one here was. But look, Marjorie, you're part of the team if you want to be. It's a legislative body. If you don't want to work together, well, that's your choice." Green had arrived in Washington for freshman orientation on a red tide of grievance. Just the week earlier, she upbraided Crenshaw, her fellow Republican member and former U.S. Navy SEAL, on Twitter for what she termed his loser mindset in not challenging the 2020 election results, prompting Crenshaw to fire back, "You're a member of Congress now, Marjorie. Start acting like one." Now, good comeback, dude. Anyway, also on Twitter, she complained that because of the pandemic and what she termed Democrat tyrannical control, no local gyms were open. "There is literally a gym around the corner from the hotel she's staying at," Ruben Gallego, a Democratic congressman from Arizona, tweeted in response. And of course, House members have their own gym. But something else occurred during that same orientation week that would alter Green's trajectory and ultimately that of the Republican Party as well. At what was intended to be a perfunctory congratulatory meeting in the Oval Office with 3 new GOP congresswomen, Green, Lauren Boebert of Colorado, and Yvette Herrell of New Mexico, Trump met Green for the first time. She immediately launched into what she later told me was a preconceived strategy about how and where Trump needed to campaign in Georgia to help swing the 2 U.S. Senate runoff elections there into the Republican column. According to a person familiar with the meeting and who requested anonymity in order to speak candidly, she owned that room with Trump. Boebert and Harrell are not pushovers, but 90 to 95% of the conversation was Marjorie and the president. As you know, listeners, they did, in fact, lose both of those runoff elections, and her genius advice was either not heeded or was terrible from the start. I'm not sure what she actually advised. But just to throw that in there, since we unfortunately keep having to tick off reasons to believe that her crazy ambitions might not actually be terrible predictions after all, because no one has stopped her yet, that's a possibility there. Maybe, who knows, whether she defined campaign strategy for the Senate there or not. I'm sure we'll find out later in the article, and it'll probably say that, unfortunately, his conservative stalwarts among his advisors convinced him to do otherwise. And if he had listened to me, it all would have gone differently. In June, I asked Green about reports I had heard that McCarthy had vowed to award her plum committee assignments in exchange for her support for his bid as House Speaker. Robert, I don't believe anything until I see it, she told me. Like the Jewish space lasers, obviously. I'm pretty smart. I've been around people. Oh, boy. I mean, she's been around people. People take me for granted a lot. I mean, you have been granted. But she doesn't know what that means. All right, whatever. I've been around the block one too many times to be handed a load of expletive, so to speak. We don't know exactly what the expletive was, but we get some idea of it. Anyway, later she told me what her committee preferences would be. I would like to be on oversight, she said. I would also like to be on judiciary. I think both of those I'd be good on. When I observed that serving on both committees, both high-profile investigative perches that had elevated Republicans like Darrell Issa, Trey Gowdy, and Jim Jordan into household names, constituted a pretty big ask, Green shot back, I completely deserve it. I've been treated like more expletives. I've been treated like garbage. Well, you are both of those things. So one, that makes some sense. And two, you just don't really understand how things work. But on the other hand, could she hold things hostage and demand that stuff? Probably not at that point. Maybe now. I don't know. In a statement for this story, I guess before I even depart from this, Jim Jordan gets whatever he wants. Like he says he wants to be on judiciary to make trouble. They put him there. He says he wants to be on oversight because there's important hearings happening there. They put him there. He wants to be on the January 6th committee. They tried to put him there. It just didn't work. So surely she's saying, well, why can't I demand the same things? I see myself as every bit as outspoken as him. But it would be very interesting to know. I mean, I don't know what Jim Jordan would say, but it would have been interesting to know what he thought, especially at that point. Like if you had gone to him in 2020, right after the election, and said, Marjorie Taylor Greene, you know her as Marjorie Taylor Greene says she's every bit as effective and outspoken and brilliant as you are as a member of Congress. Do you think that's right? Do you think she should be put on your level? Is she on a par with you? And he might have had a more diplomatic answer if he's speaking for the public record. But in private, I wonder what he would have said about that. Now, he's dumb too, so I'm not sure he would be right, but it would be an interesting conversation. Anyway, in a statement for this story, Representative James Comer, the Oversight Committee's ranking member and most likely its chairman, should the Republicans win back the House, said, if Americans entrust Republicans with the majority next Congress, we look forward to the steering committee adding new GOP members to the committee, like Representative Greene, even though she may be divorced at that point, with energy and a strong interest in partnering with us in our efforts to rein in the unaccountable swamp and to hold the Biden administration accountable for its many self-inflicted crises that it has unleashed on the American people. So a speechification of, sure, I'd accept her on the committee. But Greene's comments about what she deserves and how she feels she has been treated reveal a deeply personal grievance. What? Personal grievance? No way. Against her fellow Republicans that abides to this day, despite the party's accommodations to her. It extends back to when she was denied an audience with Republican senators as a visitor to the Capitol in 2019. Kind of like Trump getting laughed at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, right? Then to her being shunned by the GOP establishment during her 2020 campaign. Of course, they couldn't find her. She kept switching districts. It would be hard to back her. And finally, to what she views as a less than fulsome defense of her a month into her congressional tenure, when House Democrats, along with 11 Republicans, voted to strip her of her committee assignments. This event, a rarity in the history of Congress, was prompted by the surfacing late that January of more of her previous social media posts. They included her outlandish suggestions that the 2018 Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School mass shooting in Parkland, Florida was staged, and that a wildfire in California that same year was ignited by a laser beam shot from space by a prominent Jewish family, the Rothschilds, the subject of many anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Such delusions were commonly embraced in the community of QAnon followers. A week after Greene's past musings were disclosed, the House GOP conference convened to discuss whether to remove Liz Cheney from her leadership post after she voted to impeach Trump. But midway into the 4-hour discussion, the other elephant in the room stepped up to the microphone. Well, Green began, according to a recording of the meeting I obtained. Many of you I've enjoyed getting to know in my 1 month that I've been here in Congress. But there's also many more of you that I haven't gotten to meet yet, and you haven't got to know me. Some of you attack me every single day. No one really was, honestly. And I usually find that it's those of you attacking me are the ones that don't know me, and that's unfortunate. Green then tried to explain how it was that she came to embrace the conspiracy theories of the QAnon community and that now scandalized the Republican Party and jeopardized her political career. I was upset about Russian collusion conspiracy lies that I was seeing on the news every single day, Green recalled to her colleagues. So I looked into the internet and I was like, what is going on? I stumbled across something called QAnon. Yep, I did. I read about it, I posted about it, and I talked about it, and I asked questions about it. I mean, I was a total moron, is what she's saying, and they're like, yep, yeah, part is true. But I was upset about what I thought was rumors, a hoax about Russian collusion, and I said, I'm going to believe my own hoax. That was a brilliant comeback. Here, more precisely, is what she did. By the summer of 2017, Green had made contact online with a counselor in the New York public school system who shared her affinities for both President Donald Trump and dark conspiracy theories. That July, she began writing for the counselor's online publication, American Truth Seekers, under her great-grandmother's name, Elizabeth Camp. Green's argument was that and she was so proud of herself and so proud of finding the truth that she did so under the name Elizabeth Camp, which is a little weird. I mean, I've written under a pseudonym too, but it was like, no, this is clearly a pseudonym. I have a real name. It's not this. And eventually, of course, it became ridiculous to separate the two, so ditch the old name. Anyway, Green's argument was that the Russian collusion conspiracy lies had created a kind of permission structure in her mind, such as it is, and she would say on the House floor, I was allowed to believe things that weren't true. In this passive voice explanation, Green was allowed to believe that a Democratic staff member named Seth Rich had been murdered by Hillary Clinton's top advisor, John Podesta, in order to cover up the fact that it was Rich, not Russia, who had leaked Democratic emails to WikiLeaks. Later, Green would modify this conspiracy theory. It was the Latino gang MS-13, the henchmen of the Obama administration, who had murdered Seth Rich. Green was also allowed to believe that Robert Mueller, the special counsel investigating Trump's ties to Russia, was actually quietly working to bring down the Clintons, and that many in our government are actively worshiping Satan, and that Trump was single-handedly battling evil, that, as she reposted from the website MAGA Pill, thousands of pedophiles and child traffickers had been arrested since Trump was sworn in. This global evil, she was allowed to believe, was all being funded by the Saudi royals, who loved Trump for some reason, in concert with Jewish billionaires like George Soros and the Rothschild family. Green believed all of this, she claimed, not only because the media had made up lies about Trump, but also because in some dark corners of the internet, an anonymous person claiming to have military intelligence, Q clearance, had said so. I don't think there's any such thing as Q clearance, whatever that might mean. She concluded her monologue to her new GOP colleagues with an admonition. Let's make sure we keep our eyes on the enemy because they're really wanting to take all of us out. About a third of her colleagues rose to applaud her as she took her seat among them. Not everyone in the audience was moved. The headline tonight, warned the South Carolina freshman Nancy Mace, is that we tried to kick out Liz Cheney and we gave a standing ovation to Marjorie Taylor Greene. Tom Reed, a moderate from New York, spoke before Mace and was even more pointed. I'm committed to winning the majority, he told his colleagues. So how is this going to look if we kick out Liz Cheney and keep Marjorie Greene? Well, that's what you did. How is this going to play across the United States of America? How am I going to stand in front of my kids and go, you know what you did, Tom? He went on, "Dad, you kicked out a person who stood on her conscience and voted for impeachment, but you retained an individual, and this is what the perception's going to be, Marjorie, and I don't mean to offend you, that stood for white supremacy, that stood for a laser in the sky that supposedly the Jews controlled to start a fire in California." The question now confronting McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, was whether he could dissuade the Democratic majority from stripping Greene of her committee assignments. The day before the February 3rd Republican meeting, according to a source with knowledge of the exchange, he contacted the House Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer, the only Democratic leader with whom he had a relationship, as Pelosi spoke openly of her lack of respect for McCarthy, and asked, "What if we just put Marjorie on the Small Business Committee?" Hoyer advised McCarthy that this would probably not fly with the Democrats. On the morning of February 3rd, according to the same source, McCarthy called Hoyer once more. Hoyer conveyed his caucus's view that if McCarthy wasn't going to take care of his party's Marjorie Trader Greene problem, then the Democrats intended to do so. McCarthy was apoplectic. "You mark this down in the history books," he said heatedly, threatening that once the Republicans took back the majority, they would strip Democrats of committee assignments with impunity. And they may. "Kevin," Hoyer replied, "you mark this day down. This is the day I told you that your pandering for Trump is bad for your party, bad for the country, and bad for your career." Okay. Greene emerged from the episode unrepentant and unburdened of lawmaking responsibilities and enjoying the continued support of Trump, who called to offer solace the day her committee assignments were taken away. Greene did not sense the same allyship from House Republican leaders like McCarthy. "I think they stood back and said, 'Let it happen,'" she asserted to Steve Bannon on his podcast a few weeks later. So how will McCarthy feel having gone to bat for her, trying to work something out with Hoyer, and even laying it out on the line and embarrassing himself on her behalf? She stabs him in the back. What does he do as a result of that? Licks her boots. So, you tell me what's going on. There remain some Republicans, albeit fewer, who still hold office, who believe that far from being, quote, treated like garbage, as she sees it, Greene has been coddled by Republican leadership. A former longtime moderate Republican member, Charles W. Dent of Pennsylvania, told me that he recalled saying on CNN in 2020 that the GOP should have explicitly marginalized Greene from the moment she won her election, barring her from the House conference, offering her no committee assignments, and immediately endorsing a 2022 primary opponent. They obviously chose a different course, Dent said with evident chagrin. Letting her into the tent, to some extent, normalized her. And Dent went on to say, granting extreme elements like Greene so prominent a role in the party was almost certain to make life harder for Republicans in swing districts, starting with the 2022 midterms, which were shaping up to be less of a certain win for the GOP. If the Republicans underperform in the midterms, Dent told me, then maybe they'll start realizing you can't just throw away those seats. Maybe losing is what it'll take to course correct. This September, on a Wednesday afternoon in Greene's office in the Longworth Building in Washington, I bumped into Ed Buckham, an unassuming 63-year-old man who seemed out of place amid the walls covered with fan notes written to Greene from all over the nation. Buckham has been the Georgia freshman's chief of staff for nearly a year. She's been so great to work for, an absolute pleasure, he told me, adding that his last job on the Hill was 2 decades earlier when Buckham served as chief of staff for the Republican House Majority Whip Tom DeLay, one of the most effective legislative operators in modern times. I hired him because I wanted to be a very serious legislator, Greene told me later that evening, after she had cast a succession of no votes to various bipartisan House resolutions. One of them established a National Center for the Advancement of Aviation. No. I want to be a very serious member of Congress. And it's because I have true goals in Congress, and then also for the Republican Party, I think our party needs a lot of work. Very insightful. Green had previously and notoriously hired as a staff assistant the right-wing provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos, who had become a leper in conservative circles after remarking approvingly in 2016 of, quote, relationships between younger boys and older men. Green quietly parted ways with Yiannopoulos earlier this year. By contrast, the fact that Tom DeLay's former top lieutenant was now her own had received no attention. Among Ed Buckham's virtues that Green enumerated for me was that he was, quote, a strong Christian. Green has recently identified herself as a Christian nationalist. This, she maintained to me, meant nothing more and nothing less than a Christian who loves her country. I didn't even know there was a history with that phrase, she insisted, just like she didn't know anything about the Rothschilds either. Anyway, don't separate God and government and... Oh, wait, how did this come up? I'm sorry. I missed a little bit here. We're going to get to that in just a second. This past summer, she stood on a stage during a live broadcast of the religious right program Flashpoint and was prayed over by the right-wing Christian author Dutch Sheets, who has stated, don't separate God and government, and who concluded his prayer over Green with, you are highly favored. You will not fail. In Jesus' name, amen. 2 months ago, at a Turning Point USA event, another far-right pastor, Rob McCoy, concluded an interview with Green by saying, someday, please God, may she be President of the United States. Oh, boy. Green told me that while she wasn't advocating that Christianity become America's national religion, she believed that right now Christianity is practically persecuted in America. So, it's just steps away from becoming America's national religion. She wants to see teachers leading students in prayer and to see American presidents set a Christian example. Invoking Jesus, Green said, he fought against what was wrong. He ran the money changers out of the temple. He threw their tables over. So he stood strongly against things that were wrong. Though she readily volunteers that she is, quote, a sinner, Green has frequently used the word godless to describe Democrats, including Pelosi, a practicing Catholic. Green told me that Pelosi's support of abortion rights essentially disqualifies the House Speaker from being a true Christian. She does, however, ruefully admire how Pelosi wields power, and she recently told the conservative activist Charlie Kirk on his podcast that if she ever managed to hold that same position, she's got a lot of ambitions, it turns out, I would reign with an iron fist. When I mentioned this to Emmanuel Cleaver, a 77-year-old United Methodist pastor from Missouri who has been a Democratic member of Congress since 2005, he replied, I believe that she actually believes that about us, but as I remind myself all the time, sincerity alone does not make a weak doctrine strong. Cleaver went on to say, we are in an era of nationalism all across the world and here at home, and there's a symbiotic relationship between nationalism and religion. Human beings often mix their political belief with religious fervor. It allows them to think that they're God's agent. Cleaver told me that he had been unable to forget the video clip from the January 6th insurrection in which a QAnon adherent named Jacob Chansley joined other rioters in storming the vacant chamber of the Senate. Chansley, the so-called Q shaman, I guess, I always hesitate on that pronunciation, stood at the rostrum and led others in prayer, saying, thank you for allowing the United States of America to be reborn. Thank you for allowing us to get rid of the communists, the globalists, and the traitors within our government. It doesn't take much theology to understand that what many of them at the Capitol that day believed was that they were an army of God, which translated into Arabic, by the way, is Hezbollah. Just thought I would throw that in there. Anyway, that's what scares me about Christian nationalism here in America. Green's political operation is committed to the goal of reflexively demonizing nearly anyone and anything she opposes, regardless of what it costs her. Twitter has permanently suspended her personal account for repeatedly spreading untruths about COVID vaccines. Her refusal to wear a mask on the House floor during the pandemic resulted in Greens being fined more than $100,000. Her appearance on stage in February with the avowed white supremacist Nick Fuentes caused Bannon to cancel a public appearance with her in Georgia. Bannon has since brought Green back on his podcast, of course. Earlier this year, she traveled with a bodyguard, which, as the Times reported, Green paid for with campaign funds because of threats that she says have been made against her. In August, according to the local police, her house in Rome, Georgia, was repeatedly swatted. That is, someone claimed to a 911 operator that a violent crime was taking place in Green's household, compelling a SWAT team to enter the home, apparently by someone who objected to her anti-transgender rhetoric, according to a report she obtained from the police and released. But the attention economy manifestly rewards her performative combativeness, both in online donations and in social media ubiquity. That this was not just some happy coincidence, but in fact an assiduously strategized core of Green's political machine became evident more than a year ago when I met two of her senior-most advisors, who, as a precondition for our conversation, requested anonymity so that they could speak freely about their boss at a restaurant in the Atlanta suburbs. One of them challenged me, "Who do you think are the top 5 Republicans in the House, other than the ones in leadership?" The advisor then clarified that this was not a Beltway lobbyist popularity contest. I'm talking about who K Street wants, or I'm not talking about who K Street wants. I'm talking about if you had 5 House Republicans on a national ballot, who would the public vote for? It was a revealing question. Tom DeLay had once told me that there were 3 career paths for any member of Congress: to be in leadership, to be a committee stalwart, or to be a tireless advocate for your district. Green had chosen a 4th path. Her ambition was to be a national figure. She's achieved this distinction in part through an extremist posture that may well be earnestly felt, but is also politically calculated. In May, I accompanied Green on a 13-hour primary campaign swing through her district. 2 years earlier, her campaign slogan was, "Save America, Stop Socialism." Now her yard sign reads, "Save America, Stop Communism." Ooh, totally different. Her senior advisor, Isaiah Wortman, said, "We've moved the needle." I guess. That Green honestly believes America has now fallen prey to a communist regime seems unlikely. When I asked her about a claim she had made that Jamie Raskin is a communist, Green responded, "Yes, have you read about his father?" Marcus Raskin was a longtime progressive government staff member and never a member of the Communist Party. They note parenthetically. It has therefore been tempting for her detractors, and for that matter many Washington journalists, to regard her as pernicious but ultimately unserious, and, like her political godfather Trump, as someone who appears more attuned to what works as an applause line than what fits her core beliefs. I tended toward this view in my early appraisal of Green, particularly after she accosted Ocasio-Cortez on the House floor and challenged her to a debate in April of 2021, promoting the hashtag MTG versus AOC, and a month later chasing the Democrat down a corridor of the Capitol, yelling in full view of reporters, Alexandria, why won't you debate me?" But enough time spent in her orbit revealed that Green's ceaseless quest for attention did not prove or disprove anything about her right-wing fervor. Her commitment to the MAGA agenda equals, if not surpasses, Trump's. More significant, she has every intention of enacting what her Republican colleagues failed to ratify of Trump's agenda. "I've said it to them at their conference," Green told me in May in the back of her black SUV, headed to a campaign event in the Northwest Georgia town of Ringgold. "I've said it over and over. The whole reason I ran for Congress was you basically, expletive, the bed when you had your chance. You didn't fund and build the wall. You didn't repeal Obamacare. You didn't do anything about it. You call yourselves pro-life and you guys funded Planned Parenthood. You can't fail any worse than that. So no, I literally ran for Congress because they failed so badly that Nancy Pelosi became speaker again." And by the way, she was driving there in the black SUV paid for with campaign funds, as you may recall. Among the questions facing Green is whether the pugnacity she displays toward her fellow Republicans is politically sustainable. When you ask yourself how things could end up for her, Brendan Buck, who served as counselor and chief communications advisor to the former Speaker Paul Ryan, said to me, one likely possibility is that it ends when you start becoming a problem for your colleagues. Steve King became a problem for his colleagues, and so did Madison Cawthorn. Buck was referring respectively to the former Iowa congressman who was marginalized by the House GOP for expressing white supremacist views, and to the freshman from North Carolina who was defeated by a Republican primary challenger after a series of incidents that included claiming that fellow Republicans had invited him to cocaine-fueled orgies. Buck continued, it's very easy to see her becoming a problem as well, whether it's continually claiming they're not conservative enough or continually having to respond to her craziness. That's the quickest way to see yourself out the chamber. Even without alienating her Republican colleagues, Buck said, Greene faced an additional conundrum. The driving dynamic among members like her has been the battle for relevance, he told me. Everything revolves around making your voice matter and making your voice heard in the conservative media ecosystem writ large. Turning the party in the direction you want requires your viewpoint being echoed hundreds of thousands of times. Greene once told me that when the Georgia GOP establishment first encountered her in 2019, they looked at me like I was a three-headed monster. This was hardly the case anymore. Every Republican candidate in her state and more across the country seemed to be mimicking her. Georgia's 10th congressional district, to take just one example, has been vacated by the Republican incumbent Jody Hice and subsequently had a field of candidates that included 3 Greene wannabes. One was a demolition company owner whose kickoff ad featured the candidate bashing various walls and doors with a sledgehammer while promising to crush the woke mob and their cancel culture. A second pledged to introduce articles of impeachment against Biden on the first day in office, just as Greene had done. A third, Mike Collins, who ended up as the nominee, vowed during his announcement speech, I'll make a great teammate for Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. When I brought this up to Greene, she replied, it's almost cookie cutter for some of these candidates. I wonder how closely she'll actually choose to work with any of them. She didn't look or sound especially happy to be the recipient of such flattery. I thought I understood why. If everybody starts acting like Marjorie Taylor Greene, I said, then Marjorie Taylor Greene is no different from anyone else. And in the view of some people, this is Trump's problem now. Too much Trump? She asked it rhetorically. It was clear from the question that the question was one she had already been pondering. Neither of them was an inside operator like Kevin McCarthy or Mitch McConnell. And Kevin McCarthy's really not an inside operator either, but okay. Both derived their outsized influence in the GOP from their ability to command the airspace of the right-wing ecosystem. They achieved this not simply by being the most outrageous voices in the room, but also by being more outrageous today than they were the day before. They were competing against themselves and against their adoring mimics. Their rhetorical one-upmanship was increasingly dark and violent. At a Trump rally in Michigan on October 1st, the former president claimed, despite great outside dangers, our biggest threat remains the sick, sinister, and evil people from within our country. Greene, as part of Trump's warm-up act, was willing to get even more ominously specific. Democrats want Republicans dead, and they have already started the killings. The previous month, sharing an image of a darkly lit Biden speech in which the president warned that some on the right were threats to democracy, Greene tweeted, Joe Biden is Hitler, with the hashtag Nazi Joe. Yeah, Nazi Joe. Everyone loves Nazi Joe, though. It doesn't really work. Anyway, such was the dangerous game of relevancy that Greene was pursuing. In victory, her voice might well become drowned out amid a growing chorus of MAGA supplicants. Impeach Biden? When she first proposed it in January 2021, eyes rolled. Now, it was all but a given that a GOP House majority would seize upon some rationale to swiftly begin impeachment proceedings. Democrats were not just radical socialists, but communists. Greene had begun making this assertion about Democratic members of Congress back in June of 2021. Now, even the Republican National Congressional Committee, the House's the House GOP's official political organization, had solicited donations warning of creeping communism under Pelosi's Democrats. So why can't we get anywhere with my labeling her a QAnon assassin? Well, anyway, Greene's message was prevailing. What her inflammatory rhetoric might consume or ignite, and whether that would bring her ever closer to the center of power or lead to her being cast out, was yet to be known. Part of my problem is, she said quietly as her SUV rolled through northwest Georgia, I've been too early. Wow. Well, that's a good solid hour and 15 minutes of murdery Trader Greene. What an interesting profile. I don't think it's comforted me any either, but I don't know if it's scared me any more than I was scared of her when we began, just in terms of her remaining around. I'm just scared of what it means for America and the children if they can't see a comeuppance for this woman at some point in the near future. But I don't know. Doesn't look like it's coming. Just thought I'd scare the crap out of you this Friday with that news.
From Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show with David Waldman.
And there you have it, another pre-recorded Friday show. I am out on the road, hopefully enjoying myself. We'll see what we got for you on Monday. It's still a mystery even now as I record this thing for you. We'll be back Tuesday. See you next week.